The Galactic Council had watched species fight and die on Prime for 10,000 years. The planet was a killer. Its desert stretched for thousands of kilometers, and its storms could tear the skin from bone in seconds. The Council used this world to test which species deserved a voice in galactic politics. If your people could survive 3 days on Prime, you earned the right to vote. If not, you waited another 100 years to try again. Humanity had failed 17 times. Never wanted to be the 18th attempt. She was a simple geological surveyor, 28 years old, with a small research ship and a contract to study mineral deposits in the outer systems. She was not a soldier. She was not a survivor. She was just a woman who liked rocks and quiet evenings reading old books. But the universe had other plans. Her ship's engine failed above Prime. The backup systems crashed. The emergency pod launched automatically, and before could understand what was happening, she was falling through red clouds toward the deadliest desert in known space. The pod hit the sand hard, throwing her against the restraints, and when she crawled out into the burning air, she found herself surrounded by aliens. 12 warriors stood in a loose circle around her crashed pod. They were contestants in the Sandstorm trial, representatives of 6 different species, each one bred or trained or engineered for survival. They looked at like she was already dead. The largest was unnamed. His species looked like insects the size of bears, with shells harder than steel and claws that could cut through rock. He walked toward on 6 legs, his translator buzzing as he spoke. "Human," he said, "your people build good machines, but machines cannot help you here. Nothing can help you here." Did not answer. She was looking at the desert, at the endless red dunes that rolled toward the horizon in every direction. The sand was not really sand. It was silicon crystal, ground fine by millions of years of wind. When the storms came, those crystals became bullets. An ancient creature floated toward the group. His name was, and he belonged to the sentinel species, beings so old that they had watched stars die. He was the trial master, the one who would watch them struggle and record who lived and who died. "By the ancient law," announced, his voice like wind through dead trees, "anyone who lands in the trial zone must participate. There are no exceptions. There is no rescue. You will reach the spire of proving, 200 kilometers north within 3 planetary rotations. The storm arrives in 6 hours. Find shelter or die." The other contestants began to move immediately. They started digging, their powerful claws throwing sand in great arcs. The tall and thin creatures with gray skin began walking north with calm purpose. Their bodies could seal themselves completely, entering a state like death that let them survive almost anything. The natives of this world simply vanished into the dunes. They knew every cave and hiding place. Stood still. She watched the others scatter, watched them use their natural advantages, and she understood something very clearly. She could not compete with them. She could not dig faster than the. She could not seal her body like the. She did not know the land like the. If she tried to beat them at their own game, she would die. So she would not play their game. Thought about Earth. She thought about the Sahara Desert, about Death Valley. Humans had lived in those places for thousands of years, not because they were stronger than the desert, but because they were smarter. They found shade. They found water. They let the desert pass over them like a wave, and when it was gone, they were still there. She turned east, away from the spire, away from the direction everyone else was running. The other contestants did not notice. They were too focused on their own survival to care about one small human walking the wrong way. Glanced at her once, clicked his mandibles in what might have been pity, and returned to his digging. Walked for almost an hour before she found what she was looking for. They rose from the sand like frozen giants, a forest of massive spike trees that the off called blood cacti. Each one was 20 meters tall and thick as a house, covered in spines that could punch through metal. The spines were red, the color of dried blood, and they caught the light like thousands of needles pointing at the sky. Every other contestant avoided these organisms. The spines meant death to anyone who touched them, but knew something the others did not. She had read about these creatures during her geological surveys. They were not plants but silicon-based life forms that stored huge amounts of water inside their bodies. They had survived on Prime for hundreds of millions of years, which meant they had found a way to live through the storms. More importantly, she knew that the older specimens were often hollow inside, eaten out by parasites that the spike tree eventually killed, leaving empty chambers behind. She began searching, moving carefully between the deadly spines, looking for the oldest and largest specimens. The wind was getting stronger. She could feel the first bite of silicon particles against her skin. On her 7th attempt, she found it, an ancient spike tree with a small gap between two clusters of spines. The opening was barely wide enough for her shoulders, and getting through would mean getting cut. She did not hesitate. Pushed herself through the gap. The spines tore her suit and her skin. Blood ran down her arms, but she kept pushing, kept squeezing until she fell through into darkness. She was inside. The chamber was 4 meters wide and perfectly round. The walls were thick and cool. When she pressed her ear against them, she could hear liquid moving, the sound of the spike tree's blood flowing through its body. Outside, the wind began to scream. Sat down, pulled her knees to her chest, and waited. The storm was coming to kill everyone on the surface. But she was not on the surface anymore. The inside of the spike tree smelled like metal and honey. Sat in the darkness, listening to the wind grow stronger outside, and tried to control her breathing. Her arms were still bleeding from the spines. Her heart was beating too fast, but she was alive, and for now, that was enough. She turned on her small emergency light and looked around the chamber. The walls were smooth and slightly wet, covered in a thin layer of moisture that the organism produced to keep itself healthy. The floor was soft, made of dead tissue that had dried over many years. It was like sitting inside a giant living room that happened to be inside a creature older than human civilization. The temperature was perfect. Outside, the desert swung between burning heat and freezing cold, but inside the spike tree, the thick walls kept everything stable. Realized that she had found something better than a cave. She had found a living shelter that actively protected itself from the storm. But she had a problem. She had only 2 liters of water and 3 nutrient bars. That was enough for maybe one day if she was careful. The trial lasted 3 days. She would die of thirst before the storm even ended. Unless she could find more water. Looked at the wet walls again. The spike tree stored water inside its body. That was how it survived on this desert planet. If she could get to that water, she could drink it. But the walls were thick, and cutting through them might hurt the organism. If the spike tree died, she would lose her shelter. She needed to be careful. Took out her geological tools. She had a small drill meant for taking rock samples, a portable analyzer that could tell her what substances were made of, and a collection of thin tubes for gathering liquid samples. She had never imagined using these tools to survive, but she had never imagined being trapped inside an alien cactus during a planet-killing storm either. She pressed her hand against the wall and felt for the softest spot. The spike tree was not the same thickness everywhere. Some places were thin, where the organism had been damaged and healed. She found a spot near the floor where the wall was only a few centimeters thick. She could feel the liquid moving behind it. Slowly, carefully, she pushed her drill into the wall. The spike tree shuddered. For a terrible moment, thought she had made a mistake. But then the shuddering stopped, and thick fluid began to seep from the small hole she had made. It was the color of dark honey, and it smelled like wet stone. She collected the fluid in her emergency container and ran her analyzer over it. The results made her smile for the first time since her ship had crashed. The fluid was 70% water. The rest was silicon compounds and organic nutrients. If she filtered it through her survival kit's membrane, she would have something she could drink. It would taste terrible, but it would keep her alive. Set up her filter and began processing the fluid. It was slow work. Each liter took almost an hour to filter properly, but she had time. Outside, the storm was just beginning, and it would last for many more hours. She drank her first cup of filtered spike-tree water as the wind reached its full strength. The sound was incredible. It was not just wind, but a roaring, screaming, howling wall of noise that made the spike-tree shake. Could hear silicon particles hitting the outside of the organism like millions of tiny bullets. Any creature caught in that storm would be torn apart in minutes. But the spike-tree held. Its outer layer thickened in response to the assault. Its spines redirected the wind, creating small pockets of calm air around its body. It had evolved over hundreds of millions of years to survive exactly this situation, and it was very good at its job. Finished her water and lay down on the soft floor. She was exhausted. The crash, the search for shelter, the fear and the bleeding had taken everything from her. She needed to sleep. But first, she thought about the other contestants. They had been digging when she last saw him. His species could burrow deep into the ground, creating chambers where they could wait out storms. But how long could he stay down there? Did he have enough air? The storm sounded like it would last much longer than anyone expected. They had walked north toward the spire. They could seal their bodies and enter a death-like state, but remembered reading that they had limits. Extreme temperature changes could kill them even in that state, and the storm was bringing both freezing cold and burning heat, switching between them every few minutes. They knew this planet, but did they know this storm? The dunes were shifting outside, could feel the ground moving as mountains of sand relocated themselves. Landmarks would disappear, familiar caves would be buried, even local knowledge might not be enough. Closed her eyes and stopped thinking about the others. She could not help them. She could barely help herself. All she could do was survive, 1 hour at a time until the storm passed. She dreamed of Korea, of her grandmother's house in the mountains, of summer rain falling on green leaves. Her grandmother had been a farmer who survived wars and famines and everything else that history threw at her. She used to say that strong people fight the storm, but wise people find a place where the storm cannot reach them. Woke up 6 hours later. The storm was still raging outside, but inside the spike tree, everything was calm and quiet. She checked her water supply. She had filtered enough for another day if she was careful. Her wounds had stopped bleeding, though they would need proper treatment eventually. She ate half a nutrient bar, drank another cup of spike-tree water, and listened to the storm try to destroy the world. Somewhere above her, through meters of living tissue and millions of deadly spines, the other contestants were dying. She did not know it yet, but by the time she woke up again, she would be the only one left alive. The storm did not care about strength or speed or evolution. It only cared about finding things to destroy. Had made herself very hard to find. The sandstorm of Prime was not just weather. It was a monster made of wind and crystal, a planet-sized beast that woke every few years to clean the surface of anything foolish enough to stand against it. The silicon particles moved faster than bullets. The temperature jumped from freezing to boiling and back again within minutes. The electromagnetic energy scrambled all technology, leaving survivors blind and alone. The Galactic Council had records of these storms going back 10,000 years. This one was the worst they had ever seen. In orbit above the planet, the trial master watched his screens with growing disbelief. They were disappearing one by one. 12 contestants had entered the trial. Now there were 7, now 5, now 3, now 1. The human was still alive. Checked his equipment 3 times, certain there must be an error. The human should have been the first to die. Her species was soft and slow and completely unsuited for desert survival. She had no natural armor, no ability to burrow, no way to seal her body against the elements. and yet her pulsed steadily on his screen, strong and healthy, while the others flickered and went dark. "What is she doing?" he asked the empty room. The satellite images showed nothing. The storm was too thick to see through. All he had was that single point of light on his screen, that tiny pulse of life in a sea of death. Inside the spike tree slept. She had always been good at sleeping. Her friends used to joke that she could sleep through an earthquake. Now she was sleeping through something much worse, curled up on the soft floor of her living shelter, her breathing slow and steady. The spike tree protected her from everything, and she trusted it completely. She woke twice during the storm. Each time, she filtered more water from the organism's body, ate a small portion of her nutrient bars, and went back to sleep. She did not worry about what was happening outside. She could not control it. She could only control herself, and right now, herself needed rest. While she slept, the other contestants died. They had dug deep into the sand, creating a chamber 3 meters below the surface. His species could survive underground for days, breathing slowly, waiting for danger to pass. But the storm lasted longer than any storm in recorded history. 16 hours in, his oxygen ran out. He tried to dig upward to reach the surface, but the sand had compressed above him. He suffocated in the darkness, his claws still scratching at the walls. They sealed their bodies and entered their survival trance. Their species could slow their metabolism to almost nothing, surviving without food or water or air for days. But they had never faced temperatures like this. The storm brought freezing cold that turned their internal fluids to ice, then burning heat that turned that ice to steam. Their bodies could not handle the constant change. One by one, they died in their sleep, their perfect survival systems overwhelmed by a storm that did not follow the rules. They knew this planet better than anyone. They had lived here for thousands of generations. They knew every cave, every shelter, every safe place. But the storm moved the entire landscape. Dunes that had stood for centuries vanished in minutes. New mountains of sand appeared where flat ground had been. They searched for their familiar shelters and found only death. They wandered in circles, lost on their own world, until the silicon wind found them. By the end of the first day, 11 contestants were dead. Slept through all of it. The council members watched in shock as they disappeared. They had seen contestants die before, but never like this. Never all of them. The Sandstorm trial was supposed to be difficult, not impossible. There were always survivors, usually the species that had evolved specifically for harsh environments. But now there was only the human. "This is impossible," said the council representative. His voice was thick with disbelief. "Our champion was the strongest contestant. He trained for years. He was perfect." "He is dead," replied. "They are all dead except her." How is this possible?" Did not answer. He was watching the humans, watching it pulse with steady life, and he was beginning to understand something. He had watched the Sandstorm trial for a very long time. He had seen every strategy, every approach, every desperate attempt to survive, and he had never seen anyone do what this human was doing. She was not fighting the storm, she was ignoring it. The storm raged for 36 hours. It was the longest storm in 10,000 years of records, a freak event that no one could have predicted. When it finally ended, the surface of Prime looked like a different planet. The dunes had moved kilometers. The landmarks were gone. Even the trial beacons had been buried or destroyed. Inside the spike tree, opened her eyes. The silence woke her. After so many hours of roaring wind and screaming sand, the quiet felt strange, almost wrong. She lay still for a long moment, listening, making sure the storm was really over. Then she stood up, stretched her sore muscles, and began preparing to leave. She had filtered enough water to last another 2 days if she was careful. She had 1.5 nutrient bars left. Her wounds were healing but still painful. She was tired and scared and very far from home. But she was alive. She squeezed back through the gap in the spines, tearing her skin again, and emerged into a transformed world. The red dunes stretched to the horizon in every direction, but nothing looked the same. It was like waking up on a different planet. Looked north toward the spire. She had 180 kilometers to walk. She started walking. Walked alone through the red desert. The storm had changed everything. Mountains of sand stood where flat ground had been before. Deep valleys cut through places that used to be hills. The navigation beacons that marked the path to the spire were buried or broken. Her communication equipment was dead, scrambled by the electromagnetic energy of the storm. She had nothing but her geological compass and her legs. The compass was a simple device, designed to point toward magnetic north. On most planets, this would be useless for navigation. But the Spire of Proving was a magnetic anomaly, a natural formation so powerful that compasses pointed directly at it from hundreds of kilometers away. As long as followed the needle, she would find her destination. She walked northeast, 60 kilometers per day. That was her goal. Any faster and she would exhaust herself. Any slower and she would not reach the spire in time. In orbit above the planet, watched her progress with growing respect. The council members had gathered around his screens, dozens of representatives from dozens of species, all staring at the single dot moving across the desert. They had never seen anything like this. "She is not stopping," observed one of the representatives. His voice was quiet with something like wonder. "She has been walking for 8 hours. She should be resting." "Humans do not work that way," replied. "They are persistence hunters. Their ancestors chased prey across savannas for days at a time, walking and walking until the prey collapsed from exhaustion. She is doing what her species has always done." "But she is so slow," said, "and so fragile. How can she possibly survive?" "Watch," said, "just watch." On the surface, kept walking. Her body hurt in ways she had never experienced before. Her feet were blistered inside her boots. Her legs burned with every step. Her skin was cracked from the dry air, and her lips were bleeding. The filtered water from the spike tree tasted like metal and chemicals, but she drank it anyway, small sips every hour, keeping herself hydrated. She did not think about the distance. She did not think about the pain. She thought only about the next step, and then the next step, and then the next step after that. Her grandmother had taught her this trick. When the task is too big, make it smaller. When the mountain is too high, look only at your feet. Step, step, step. The first day ended with the sun dropping below the horizon. The temperature began to fall immediately, dropping from burning heat to freezing cold in less than an hour. Needed to find shelter. She searched for another spike tree but found nothing. The storm had destroyed the forest she had sheltered in before, snapping the organisms like twigs and scattering their remains across the desert. She was alone on a flat plain with no protection from the cold. So she made her own shelter. Dug a hole in the sand, just deep enough to lie down in. She covered herself with her thermal blanket, then pulled sand over the blanket until only her face was exposed. The sand was still warm from the day's heat. It would insulate her through the night, keeping her body temperature stable while the air above turned to ice. She slept in 15-minute intervals, waking each time to check her hands and feet for frostbite. It was not comfortable. It was not safe. But it was survival, the ugly, unglamorous kind of survival that kept people alive when everything else failed. Morning came. Dug herself out of the sand, shook the crystals from her hair, and started walking again. The second day was harder than the first. Her water was running low. Her food was almost gone. Her body was beginning to fail, muscles screaming for rest that she could not give them. But she kept walking, following the compass needle, counting her steps to keep her mind occupied. At noon, she found a dead. The body was half buried in the sand, only an arm and a head visible above the surface. The eyes were open, staring at the sky, filled with sand that had blasted into them during the storm. Stopped and looked at the body for a long moment. She had not known this person. They had not spoken during the brief time before the trial began, but they had died here on this desert, trying to reach the same destination that was walking toward. They had probably known this planet better than ever would, and it had not been enough. Knelt beside the body and closed the eyes. It was a human gesture, meaningless to the dead alien, but it made her feel better. Then she searched the body for supplies. She found a container of water, still sealed, and 2 packets of nutrient paste. They did not need them anymore and did. She whispered a thank you to the dead stranger and kept walking. The second night, she found a small cave carved into a rock formation that had survived the storm. It was barely large enough for her body, but it protected her from the wind and the cold. She slept better than she had since the trial began. The third morning, she saw the spire. It rose from the desert like a giant needle pointing at the sky, 300 meters of magnetic rock that glittered red and black in the morning light. It was still 50 kilometers away, but she could see it clearly, and the sight gave her strength she did not know she had. Smiled, cracked lips and all, and started walking faster. In orbit, the council watched her approach the finish line. They had been watching for 3 days now, a collection of the most powerful beings in the galaxy, all focused on one small human walking through a desert. They had started with curiosity. Now they watched with something closer to awe. "She is going to make it," said quietly. "The human is going to make it." No one argued with him. The spire of proving was beautiful up close. Had seen it from 50 kilometers away, a distant needle on the horizon. Now she stood at its base, looking up at 300 meters of magnetic rock that twisted toward the sky like frozen lightning. Iron and other metals had been drawn to this spot over millions of years, building layer upon layer until the formation became something almost alive, something that sang with magnetic energy. At the base of the spire sat a simple platform with a biometric scanner. This was the end of the trial. All had to do was press her hand against the scanner, and she would become the first human in 18 attempts to complete the Sandstorm trial. She stood there for a long moment, swaying on her feet, her body finally admitting how tired it was. 3 days of walking, 2 nights of terrible sleep, almost no food and barely enough water. She had lost weight she could not afford to lose. Her skin was burned and cut and covered in sand. Her muscles had stopped hurting because they had stopped feeling anything at all. But she was here, she had made it. Pressed her hand against the scanner. The machine hummed, a light turned green, and somewhere in orbit the official record of the Galactic Council updated itself, adding a new line, Trial COMPLETED. Species, human, contestant, YUNA. Time, 71 hours, 23 minutes. She sat down on the platform and started to cry. The council shuttle arrived an hour later. It descended from the red sky like a silver bird, landing softly on the sand near the spire. The door opened and floated out, his ancient body moving without touching the ground. He approached slowly, studying her with eyes that had watched civilizations rise and fall. She was still sitting on the platform, too tired to stand, her tears dried to salt tracks on her dirty face. "Human," said, "you have completed the Sandstorm trial. You have earned the right to speak for your species in the Galactic Council. You have done what no human before you has done." He paused. "How?" Thought about the question for a long time before answering. "On my planet," she said, her voice rough from thirst and exhaustion, "there is a desert called the Sahara. It is one of the most dangerous places on Earth. Nothing should be able to live there, but people do live there. They have lived there for thousands of years." She looked up at. "They do not fight the desert. They do not try to be stronger than the sand or faster than the wind. They just find ways to let the desert pass over them. They find shade, they find water, they wait." "The other contestants were stronger than you," said. "They were faster, better adapted to survival." "They tried to beat the trial," replied. "I just tried to outlast it. There is a difference." Was silent for a moment. Then he did something that surprised deeply. He bowed to her, a gesture of respect that his species reserved for only the most honored individuals. "Come," he said, "the council wishes to meet you." The council chamber was a vast room at the heart of the orbital station, filled with representatives from 100 different worlds. They sat in curved rows that rose toward a domed ceiling painted with images of stars and galaxies. When entered, supported by medical staff who were pumping fluids back into her body through tubes in her arms, every eye in the room turned to look at her. The representative stood to address the assembly. 17 times humanity sent its strongest warriors to the Sandstorm trial, he said. 17 times they failed. We believed your species was too weak, too fragile, too poorly adapted for survival outside your home world. He paused, his insect eyes fixed on. We were wrong. The assembly murmured in agreement. You did not survive because you were stronger than the storm, continued. You survived because you understood something that we had forgotten. Survival is not about power. It is not about fighting. It is about seeing what is truly there and responding to it wisely. He spread his claws in a gesture that meant acceptance. Humanity, we welcome you to the Galactic Council. The representatives of 100 worlds began to applaud, each in their own way. Some clapped like humans. Some clicked or hummed or flashed colors. The sound filled the chamber like music. Stood in the middle of it all, barely able to stay on her feet, still covered in sand and blood and 3 days of desperate survival. She was supposed to say something historic, something that would be remembered for generations, something worthy of this moment. Instead, she said, "Thank you, but honestly, I just really needed a nap and that cactus looked comfortable." The council did not understand human humor, but in the years that followed, as they worked alongside humanity and learned more about this strange, soft, stubborn species, they began to understand something important. Humans were not the strongest species in the galaxy. They were not the fastest or the most evolved. They did not have natural armor or special abilities or perfect survival systems. But they had something else. They had the ability to look at an impossible situation and find the small, simple solution that everyone else had missed. They had the patience to walk for days when others would have given up. They had the humility to hide inside a plant while warriors fought and died around them. And most importantly, they had the wisdom to know that sometimes the best way to win was not to fight at all. The galaxy would remember not as a great warrior or a brilliant scientist. They would remember her as the woman who slept through the apocalypse and walked out the other side. It was, the council eventually agreed, a very human way to survive.